It was just after sunset when the police cruiser came to a screeching halt at the corner of the quiet street. The officer in the passenger seat, a seasoned cop named Tyler, stared out of the window, scanning the area with practiced precision. He had seen it all. Or so he thought. Across the street, a black man walked briskly, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn coat. He was nothing special, just another ordinary figure moving down the pavement. His pace didn't suggest anything out of the ordinary, but to the officers in the cruiser, something about him didn't sit right. Tyler nodded to his partner, Officer Jenna, signaling her to get out of the car. They had no real reason to stop him, but something about this man, his posture, the way he moved, just didn't feel right. Jenna stepped out of the cruiser first, the chill air hitting her like a slap in the face. She straightened her uniform and began walking toward the man, who now seemed to have noticed the patrol car. He paused, only for a moment, before continuing his steady pace down the street. "Hey, you!" Jenna called out, her voice firm and commanding. The man flinched slightly but didn't stop walking. "Stop right there." He stopped, slowly turning to face her. The tension was instant. His eyes, dark yet sharp, met hers with a calm that was almost unsettling. He didn't look like someone who was caught off guard, not at all. There was something about him, something Jenna couldn't put her finger on. "Can I help you, officer?" the man asked, his voice deep, steady, and polite. Tyler exited the cruiser, standing a few paces behind Jenna. He watched the interaction from a distance, arms crossed, but there was a growing sense of suspicion that started to creep in. "We've got reports of a suspect matching your description," Jenna said, her tone shifting from neutral to accusatory. "You fit the description of someone seen near a robbery earlier today." The man's expression didn't change. He stood still, unfazed by the accusation. "I'm not sure how I can help with that," he replied calmly. "I've been on this street the whole time. I don't know anything about a robbery." Tyler stepped forward, his gaze narrowing. "We're not asking for your cooperation, we're telling you. You're coming with us." His hand rested near his holster, though his fingers didn't quite touch the weapon. It wasn't a threatening gesture, not yet, but it was enough to show who had the power here. The man's face twitched, just a hint of frustration, but he held it in. "I don't need to go anywhere with you," he said. "You have no reason to detain me." "That's where you're wrong," Tyler shot back. His voice was sharp, dismissive. "You match the description, you're not going anywhere until we sort this out." There was a pause. A long, unbearable silence where the wind rustled through the leaves on the nearby trees. The man seemed to be weighing his options, and then, as if making a decision, he raised his hands slowly, stepping back. "I'm not resisting," he said, his voice even. "But I'm also not going anywhere." Jenna moved to grab his arm, but the man pulled away quickly, a swift movement that caught both officers off guard. It wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. He didn't seem like he was trying to run, he was merely asserting his right to stand his ground. "You've got to be kidding me," Tyler muttered under his breath. "This isn't a negotiation." In a split second, Jenna's hand shot out again, grabbing for his arm, but before she could tighten her grip, the man stepped back, his body language suddenly defensive. "That's enough," he said quietly, the calm still in his voice, but now there was a coldness to it. "I'm asking you one more time, why am I being detained? What is this about?" The officers hesitated. Tyler's face flushed red. He didn't like being challenged, and the frustration started to show. "You're being detained because we say so. Now stop resisting and come with us." The man didn't say anything at first. His eyes darted from Jenna to Tyler, assessing the situation. He didn't look afraid, didn't seem rattled, but there was a hard determination behind his gaze that Jenna couldn't ignore. And just as the tension in the air thickened to an almost unbearable level, something about the situation shifted. The man didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't run. He just stood there, waiting. But what the officers didn't know, what neither of them could have possibly guessed, was that the man they were confronting wasn't just any person. He wasn't just another man on the street caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't just another black man to be wrongfully accused and humiliated by the system. He was the chief prosecutor. And he wasn't about to let this go. The silence between them stretched even longer as the officers realized, far too late, who they were dealing with. What would they do next? The answer lingered in the air, unanswered, as the scene faded to black. The street was eerily quiet now. Only the distant hum of city traffic could be heard as Jenna and Tyler stood in front of the man, their eyes narrowing as they tried to make sense of the situation. The tension between them felt like it could snap at any moment, but the man didn't seem to notice. He stood there, still, calm, his hands slowly lowering from where they had been raised in defense. His posture didn't change, nor did the expression on his face. There was no sign of fear, no indication that he was going to back down. Tyler took a step closer, his tone more forceful now. "I said you're coming with us. You don't get to make the rules here." His words were sharp, cutting through the silence that had fallen over the scene. Jenna, standing by his side, crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on the man. Her brow furrowed with increasing suspicion. "You still haven't told us who you are," Jenna added, her voice tight with frustration. "You've been given more than enough chances to cooperate. This attitude is only making things worse for you." The man didn't flinch. He remained calm, his voice steady as he spoke. "I've already told you, I'm not resisting. But I don't have to tell you who I am. I'm not the person you're looking for." Jenna's eyes flickered, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "That's not how this works. We've got a report of a suspect who fits your description. You're not getting off that easy." She moved in closer, her hands now visibly tense by her sides. Tyler nodded, his jaw tightening as he shifted his weight. "You think you can just walk away from this?" His voice was filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief, as though the man's calm demeanor had somehow offended him. "You think because you're walking around in a suit, you get special treatment?" "I'm not asking for special treatment," the man replied, his voice still calm but firm. "I just don't see how I'm involved in this." Jenna's eyes narrowed further, and she took another step toward him, almost daring him to make a move. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" She spat the words out, her tone dripping with disdain. "Walking around, looking all important like you've got something to prove." Tyler exchanged a glance with Jenna, and without warning, he took another step toward the man, blocking his path. "You know what? You're not going anywhere until we get some answers. And I'm getting tired of your attitude. You want to play it cool? Fine. But I'm done playing nice." His hand went to his belt, brushing against the radio, and his fingers hovered just over his taser. The man stayed silent, his eyes never leaving theirs, but his pulse quickened slightly. The moment had gone from uncomfortable to dangerous, but he wasn't about to give in. He refused to let their assumptions about who he was cloud the truth. Despite the rising hostility, he knew he couldn't reveal himself, not yet. There was too much at stake. But the weight of his silence seemed to make the officers more agitated, more determined to force an answer out of him. "You're clearly hiding something," Jenna muttered, her voice laced with suspicion. She looked at her partner, frustration building. "We've got the right guy. This one's definitely guilty of something." The word stung, but the man remained silent. He could feel the racial bias growing between them, he could see the way they were sizing him up. The way their eyes seemed to evaluate him, not as an individual, but as a threat because of the color of his skin. He knew that if they were in a different neighborhood, with a different man standing there, they wouldn't have escalated things so quickly. He could feel their assumptions. The frustration was starting to build in his chest, but he kept his emotions in check, refusing to show any sign of weakness. What's your name? Tyler demanded again, his voice suddenly more menacing. I don't care who you think you are, you're not getting away with this. You don't get to just walk off like nothing's happening. Still, the man remained unmoved. He was acutely aware of the racial undertones in their words, the subtle but unmistakable way they were treating him as if his presence was a threat by default. Every question they asked seemed like an accusation, every movement they made felt like a challenge. He knew they would never treat a white man the same way. But he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. If he gave them an inch, they'd take a mile. Jenna's frustration bubbled to the surface. I said, "What's your name?" she repeated, her tone snapping with finality. The man took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. I'm just a man walking down the street. You've got nothing on me. The more he spoke, the more the officers seemed convinced he was lying. The tension in the air thickened. It was like they had already made up their minds. They weren't just interrogating him, they were accusing him, judging him, and it was clear they didn't care to listen to his side of the story. With his heart pounding in his chest, the man weighed his options. He couldn't reveal who he truly was, not yet. But every passing second felt like another layer of injustice being added on top of him. He could see the storm building, the anger in their eyes as they believed they were right. The racial bias, the stereotypes, they were all playing out right in front of him. The officers were getting ready to take him in, to haul him off to wherever their minds had decided he belonged. But what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that this wasn't just any man they were dealing with. This wasn't some random streetwalker who could be dismissed with a few harsh words. No, this was the man they had wrongfully accused of a crime. The man they didn't know had the power to expose their lies and bring them down. But they didn't know that yet. The moment stretched on, and the man stood his ground, his heart heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Would this injustice be corrected? The answer would soon come, but not before everything changed. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the space between the three of them. Jenna and Tyler stood there, their eyes locked on the man before them, frustration, suspicion, and impatience boiling inside them. They were certain he was hiding something, that he had something to answer for. The tension was palpable, and it seemed like the situation was about to escalate further. Jenna, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, took a step forward, her voice filled with more aggression than before. You know, I don't have time for your games. We're done here. You're coming with us. The man didn't flinch, his eyes calm as ever. He stood perfectly still, as if the escalating situation wasn't threatening at all. His silence was like a wall, and the more they tried to push, the more it seemed to frustrate them. Don't make me do this, Tyler added, his voice growing harsh. You don't want to find out what happens when you push too far. But still, the man didn't respond. He remained composed, his every muscle tight but under control, as if he were deciding the best moment to speak. Finally, the man exhaled slowly, his breath steady and measured. The atmosphere shifted as he slowly raised his chin, a quiet authority in his demeanor that had gone unnoticed until now. I think it's time I tell you who I am, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. The words came slow, deliberate, as though they held more weight than the officers could have ever imagined. I'm not just anyone. I'm the chief prosecutor for this city. There was a long pause. Jenna froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tyler's face, which had been filled with determination only moments before, now displayed a look of utter confusion. The air felt suddenly colder, heavier. The power dynamic had shifted in a way they could never have prepared for. Wait, what? Tyler sputtered, his brow furrowing in confusion. He glanced at Jenna, who was equally stunned. Neither of them had expected this. They were expecting a criminal, a suspect, someone who could be quickly dismissed or intimidated into submission. But this? This revelation was something else entirely. The man stood tall, his eyes unwavering, his voice firm. You heard me. I am the chief prosecutor. And you have just wrongfully detained me, accused me of something I had no part in. You've made a mistake. A big one. Jenna blinked several times, as if trying to process the words, trying to make sense of what was happening. But, we were just doing our job, she said, though her voice lacked the same certainty it had moments ago. The reality of the situation seemed to be slowly sinking in, and with it came a rush of uncertainty. No, the man said, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. You were doing more than that. You were allowing your biases to make decisions for you. You didn't stop to think for even a second. You saw a black man and assumed the worst. You accused me without a shred of evidence, and you treated me like a criminal from the moment I stepped into your line of sight. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the officers felt a sinking feeling in their stomachs. Their anger, their frustration, their suspicion, they had all been based on something they hadn't questioned, their own biases. They had assumed the man was guilty because of his race. And now, standing before him, they realized how wrong they had been. But the man wasn't done. He stood taller now, his voice gaining strength with every word. You don't get to decide who I am based on how I look, based on your assumptions. You don't have that right. And now, you're going to face the consequences of your actions. Tyler took a step back, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to say, how to react. The chief prosecutor's words rang in his ears, and the gravity of the situation started to settle in. This wasn't just a random encounter anymore. This was something much bigger, something that could ruin both their careers. Jenna, still processing, tried to regain her composure. So, what now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Are we just supposed to walk away? You're going to be held accountable for what you've done, the man said calmly. And I'll make sure of that. I don't care about your excuses or your justifications. What matters now is the truth. The officers stood in stunned silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. They had crossed a line they couldn't undo, and now they had to face the consequences. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The man they had seen as a mere suspect was now in a position to dismantle everything they stood for. Around them, the streets seemed quieter now, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The cars, the people walking by, they were all oblivious to what was happening here. But for the three of them, everything had changed. The question now wasn't just about who was right or wrong. It was about what would happen next. Would the officers face any repercussions? Would they be held accountable for their actions? Or would this moment fade into the background, like so many others before it, forgotten until it was too late? The chief prosecutor's words hung in the air, unanswered, as the two officers stood there, stunned by the weight of their mistake. The emotional tension was thick, and as the realization of what they had done began to sink in, it was clear that things were only going to get worse from here. The real question now was, would justice prevail, or would they continue to evade it? The tension between them built to a boiling point, and the next few moments would determine everything. The moment the confrontation ended, the chief prosecutor stood there for a few moments longer, his eyes fixed on the officers as they stood, still stunned, trying to process the reality of what had just occurred. The adrenaline from the encounter slowly began to fade, replaced by a quiet, gnawing unease. He had made his point, but now the weight of his position settled heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just any person. He was the chief prosecutor, the one responsible for ensuring that justice prevailed in his city. His family's well-being, his career, and his reputation all depended on the choices he made now. He had to think carefully. He walked away from the street corner, away from the two officers who were still standing there, probably wondering what had just happened. His mind raced as he moved toward his car. The night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the injustice he had just faced, on the way the officers had treated him without a second thought, as if his identity meant nothing. To them, he was just another black man walking the streets, a potential criminal to be stopped and questioned. That thought stung deeply. He had endured discrimination his entire life, but this was different. This wasn't just a casual encounter. This was a complete violation of his rights. A direct challenge to who he was, to everything he had worked for. A challenge to the very system he had worked his whole life to be a part of. But then, as the car door clicked shut and the engine rumbled to life, the question lingered in the back of his mind, what now? What was the right thing to do? He had the power, the authority, to make the officers pay. To expose their ignorance and their bias to the public, to hold them accountable in the court of law. He had the resources to do so. But at what cost? If he went after them, if he dragged them through the legal system, there was a good chance his career would be marked by it forever. He could win the case, of course, but the personal toll it would take on him, the media scrutiny, the public backlash, and the weight of being labeled a troublemaker by some of his colleagues. He couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it. Then there was his family. His wife, his children, they would feel the strain. They had always been proud of his position, proud that he had risen to such a level of success. He had always been the beacon of righteousness in their eyes. But if he pursued this, if he made it public, if he dug into the officers' pasts, it would become a scandal, a very public scandal. His family would have to deal with the fallout. His children would have to face the judgment of their peers. Could he do that to them? On the other hand, he couldn't just let it go. He couldn't stand by and pretend like what had happened wasn't a clear violation of everything he stood for. If he let the officers off the hook, if he didn't hold them accountable, it would send the wrong message. It would tell everyone, including his own community, that no matter how high he had risen, no matter how much he had achieved, it didn't matter. Not really. Not when it came to standing up against injustice. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, the weight of the decision threatening to overwhelm him. Justice had always been his guiding principle. He had chosen this path because he wanted to fight for what was right. But this was different. This was personal. He wasn't just upholding the law now, he was fighting for his dignity, his pride. He was fighting for something that went deeper than the case files he'd worked through for years. The road stretched ahead of him, but it felt like there was no clear direction. He couldn't just let it slide. He couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. But at the same time, pursuing the officers would open a whole new set of problems. Problems he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He pulled over to the side of the road, taking a deep breath and staring out into the night. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. He closed his eyes for a moment, his mind racing as the thoughts collided with each other. His past experiences, his values, his emotions, they all swirled together, making it impossible to see clearly. His thoughts kept drifting back to the faces of the officers, to the way they had looked at him, as if he didn't belong. He remembered their sneering glances, their dismissive tones. He could still hear their words echoing in his mind. The way they'd assumed he was guilty simply because of his race, because of who they thought he was. He had worked his entire life to rise above that. He had fought tooth and nail to prove that he wasn't just another statistic. That he was capable, competent, and worthy of respect. But in that moment, it didn't matter who he was. All that mattered was that he was a black man. A target for their prejudices. And they had made their assumptions without any consideration of his rights, his dignity, or his worth. The emotional toll of it all began to hit him harder. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface started to boil over, but with it came a deep sadness. He didn't want this fight. He didn't want to have to prove himself again. But if he didn't stand up now, if he didn't do something about it, it would all have been for nothing. The decision was no longer just about justice or revenge. It was about integrity. It was about showing the world that no matter what you faced, no matter how high the stakes were, you could still stand tall. You could still fight for what was right. He took a deep breath, wiped his face with his hand, and started the car again. It was time to make a decision. Time to make the call. The road ahead may have been unclear, but one thing was certain. Whatever choice he made, the consequences would be felt by more than just him. It was a decision that would ripple outward, touching his career, his family, and the very system he had spent his life working to improve. The investigation had only just begun, and the emotional weight of what was to come would weigh on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The journey toward justice was about to get even more complicated. The phone call came early the next morning, right as the chief prosecutor was settling in at his desk, ready to start the day. The ring of the phone cut through the silence, and he hesitated for only a second before picking it up. Chief Prosecutor's office, he answered, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of everything that had happened the night before. "Sir," came the voice on the other end, a familiar one, his assistant, Kara. "I just got word. The officers involved in your encounter are being placed under investigation. The department wants a full report." His heart sank at the news, but he tried not to let it show. "How far along are they?" "Not far. It's still early, but the Internal Affairs Division has been notified, and they'll be conducting a formal review. They've already started pulling in witnesses to corroborate your side of things." The weight of the words hit him harder than he expected. The officers would face an internal investigation, the wheels of justice slowly turning in their direction. But there was no easy way to navigate this. This wasn't just about holding the officers accountable, it was about everything else that came with it, the public scrutiny, the media frenzy, the blowback he knew would come from some parts of his community and colleagues. The backlash could be severe, and it was hard not to wonder how much of it was really worth it. The internal investigation was a starting point, but it wasn't the end. This wasn't just about a minor mistake or a simple misunderstanding. What had happened the night before was a reflection of systemic issues, of racial bias ingrained deeply within certain members of the force. This was bigger than the two officers involved, it was a call to confront something far more ingrained in the system, something that stretched far beyond one moment in time. As the day passed and the investigation began to unfold, the chief prosecutor found himself feeling the emotional toll in ways he hadn't anticipated. There was a deep pit of anger, but it wasn't the anger he thought he'd feel. It wasn't the kind of righteous fury that came with knowing you were right and ready to fight for it. Instead, it was something much darker, something that gnawed at his core. His career, his place in the justice system, and the reputation he had worked so hard to build were all on the line now. The stakes were higher than ever before. The moment had turned into something far more complicated, something he didn't know how to navigate. Should he seek justice through the system, holding the officers accountable to the full extent of the law? Or should he step back, show restraint, and allow the consequences to unfold in their own time? The emotional weight of the decision was more than he had anticipated. He had always believed in the power of the system, in the promise of justice for everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. But now, standing at the crossroads, the world felt far more complicated. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew it would come at a personal cost. As the investigation continued, the details began to emerge. The officers were being questioned by Internal Affairs. Witnesses were coming forward, including civilians who had seen the altercation from across the street. One by one, the truth was slowly being pulled out into the open, and it was clear now that the officers had acted with racial bias, their actions driven by assumptions rather than facts. The chief prosecutor sat at his desk, staring at the stack of reports that had come in. His eyes drifted to the window, where the sun hung low in the sky. He thought about the conversation he'd had with his wife, the one that had kept him up late last night. She had asked him if it was worth it. If it was worth risking everything for something that might not change. And he had said, yes, without hesitation. But now, with each passing moment, he wasn't so sure. His family, his career, everything was being tested now. He knew the implications of taking action. If he pushed forward, if he pursued the officers with everything he had, there would be no turning back. His position in the legal world, in the city's political landscape, would be forever changed. His colleagues might see him as a hero, but they might just as easily see him as a troublemaker. Those who had supported him would now have to choose sides. And those who had always been on the fence? Well, they'd have to make their decisions too. The emotional conflict was deepening with each passing day. What he had done, what he had chosen to do, had set the wheels of an unstoppable force into motion. Now, he was stuck in the middle, unsure of how much further he could go. He wanted to make sure that justice was done, but was it worth the risk? Was it worth sacrificing everything for a cause that might not lead anywhere? Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, he sat in his office alone. The room was dim, only the light from his desk lamp cutting through the shadows. He looked at the file in front of him, the officers' names and the details of their actions. He had seen these men around the courthouse before, had worked with them in some capacity. They weren't strangers, and that made this even harder. The phone buzzed on his desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was an alert from the Internal Affairs Division. The investigation had hit a new level. The officers had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. But the tone of the report was ominous. There was now a possibility that the charges could go beyond internal matters. The officers might face criminal charges for their actions. For a moment, everything went still. The decision, the weight of it, was clear now. He couldn't back down. He couldn't let this go. If he let them walk away from this, if he chose to let the system cover up their mistakes, he would be just as guilty as they were. The investigation had to go all the way. Justice had to be done. But at the same time, he knew what that meant. It meant that his career could be over. His family's life could be upended. And he would have to carry that weight for the rest of his life. With a deep breath, he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering the strength he needed. It was time to make the call. The investigation was no longer just about two officers. It was about something much bigger. And as the chief prosecutor, it was his responsibility to ensure that justice was done, no matter the cost. The pressure came from every direction. The moment the news broke that the chief prosecutor had been involved in an incident with two police officers, the story exploded. Headlines across the city's newspapers carried the details: top prosecutor accused of targeting officers, racial profiling allegations rock legal system, and chief prosecutor faces scrutiny after confrontation with police. It didn't take long for the media frenzy to build, and with it, the tension in his life escalated. He had hoped for time to think, a moment to breathe before the world began pulling him in every direction. But it didn't come. The calls began the morning after the news broke, calls from colleagues, from the mayor's office, from his family, and from people who had never once cared about his work until now. Some were supportive, urging him to follow through and bring justice, while others called him a troublemaker, a man willing to destroy his career for the sake of a personal vendetta. There were people who had always respected him, who now questioned his decisions, and others who had always been skeptical of his rise to power, now ready to pounce on any misstep. His phone buzzed constantly. Every hour, it seemed, another colleague from the office reached out to check in, offer their thoughts, or ask what was going to happen next. There was the occasional voice of dissent, a few whispers about whether his pursuit of justice was too much, too fast, given the racial tension the case was stirring up. The idea that someone so high up in the system would now turn his back on it, challenge it so publicly, well, it left many uncomfortable. And then there was his family. His wife, Yara, had stayed quiet at first, but now that the media storm had hit full force, she couldn't stay silent any longer. One evening, as the chief prosecutor sat at his kitchen table, the dim light above casting long shadows, Yara sat across from him, her arms crossed tightly. The soft click of her fingers tapping against the table was the only sound in the room as the tension hung thick between them. "I just don't understand why this had to happen now," Yara said quietly, her voice low but filled with an undercurrent of concern. "You've worked so hard to get where you are. We've worked so hard. And now this. I get that you want justice, but why put everything we've built at risk?" He stared at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, his hands tightly gripping the mug. He had tried to explain himself, tried to convey the moral urgency that had driven him to act, but her words echoed in his mind. "I didn't ask for this, Yara," he said finally, his voice rough. "But I couldn't stand by and let it happen. This isn't just about me. It's about everything I've fought for. About what's right." "But the world doesn't see it that way," she countered, her voice soft but firm. "People are going to see this as you turning on your own. You're already getting hate from people in the office, people you've worked with for years. You're one of the few black men in this position. This could be the end of everything we've worked for." Her words stung, not because they weren't true, but because he knew they were. The very thing he had worked his entire life to build, his career, his reputation, his family's future, was now being threatened by the same racial bias he had spent years trying to rise above. He had always known the system was flawed, but never in a way that so personally affected him. Now, as the scrutiny grew, as the media fed on the drama, he began to feel the isolation. Colleagues who once had his back were now walking a fine line, trying to appear neutral, afraid of being dragged into the controversy. And even though there were supporters, even though there were voices of encouragement, they were drowned out by the louder ones, the critics who were questioning his integrity, his professionalism, and his loyalty. The tension with Yara had reached a boiling point, and their conversations became strained. She understood, in theory, what he was trying to do, but she couldn't reconcile it with the reality of their lives. The public didn't care about his moral righteousness, they cared about the scandal. The media didn't care about his career-long commitment to fairness, they cared about a story. And so did his colleagues. When the investigation into the officers began, it wasn't just about the two men who had wrongly detained him, it became about the chief prosecutor himself. He was no longer seen as an impartial figure in the system. He was now the face of a controversy. His professional credibility was on the line. The same colleagues who had once trusted his judgment now began to hesitate, unsure of how far this story would reach or how it might affect their own standing. The phone call from his boss, the district attorney, was especially difficult. "Listen, I get it," the DA started, his voice tight with concern, "but this is bigger than you. You need to think about the implications of what you're doing. The city is on edge, the media is spinning this in all sorts of directions, and now there's talk of a full-blown racial profiling investigation. You need to focus on the bigger picture." "I am focused on the bigger picture," the chief prosecutor responded, his voice cold. "I'm focusing on justice." "I understand that," the DA said, but the doubt in his voice was clear. "But what you're doing could cost us. It could cost you. You have to ask yourself if it's worth it." The pressure was mounting. On one hand, he knew that pursuing this case to its full extent would likely bring justice to the officers who had wronged him, but it could also bring down everything he had built. He had to make a choice. Would he stand by his principles and face the consequences, or would he back down, swallowing his pride and letting the system take its course? The weight of it all pressed down on him as the night wore on. The phone calls kept coming, and every conversation seemed to push him further into a corner. Every argument with his family, every concerned colleague, every sympathetic voice that came with a caveat made it harder to see the way forward. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm, to be the one people could rely on for a level-headed decision, but now he was drowning in the complexity of the situation. His next move would determine everything: his career, his future, and whether he would continue to be the person he had always claimed to be. The pressure was unbearable, and with every passing moment, the stakes rose higher. His mind raced with the decision he knew he had to make, but every answer seemed to have a cost. The pressure was mounting, and as the hours ticked by, it was becoming clear that something had to give. The tension in the air was palpable, and the question that loomed over him was simple yet terrifying: could he hold on to his moral compass, or would he crumble under the weight of the consequences? The weeks following the start of the investigation had been nothing short of grueling. The pressure from every angle had only intensified as the story developed, and now, the truth about the officer's actions was finally coming to light. The evidence was undeniable. The testimonies, the footage from nearby security cameras, the witness statements, it all pointed in one direction: the officers had acted out of racial bias, mistaking the chief prosecutor for a criminal based solely on his appearance. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a clear case of discrimination. The city's Internal Affairs Department had issued its findings, and now the press conference was set. The chief prosecutor sat in his office, staring at the screen of his computer, where he saw the headlines flash across the screen. Officers in racial profiling scandal, one headline blared. 2 cops under investigation after wrongful arrest of chief prosecutor, another screamed. The public was outraged, and the media was eating up every detail of the story. There was no turning back now. His phone buzzed again. Another message from his wife. "Are you watching the news?" He had been. It was impossible not to. The entire city was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. But now that the truth was out there, the pressure had shifted. The narrative had changed. It wasn't just about 2 rogue officers anymore. It was about the system itself, about the racism that was woven into the very fabric of law enforcement. The entire department was being scrutinized, and everyone in his circle was talking about what would happen next. He had spent the past few days reviewing the investigation files, looking over the statements, and asking himself the same question over and over again: what now? What should he do? The evidence was clear. The officers had crossed a line. They had assumed his guilt based on nothing but prejudice and a stereotype they had bought into. But that wasn't the end of it. The system had a way of protecting its own, especially when the ones in question were part of the force. The chief prosecutor knew how these things worked. There was a very real possibility that the department would do its best to cover this up, to keep it from spiraling into a larger issue. The decision that lay before him wasn't just about holding the officers accountable, it was about the larger question of how far the system was willing to go to protect itself from the truth. The phone buzzed again. A call this time. His assistant. "Sir, there's a press conference scheduled for tomorrow. The mayor's office wants a statement from you. The city council is getting involved now. The public is demanding answers." He gripped the edge of his desk, staring out the window into the city. There was a moment of silence, and then the weight of it all crashed down on him. He had worked his whole life to reach this point. To be someone who was respected, trusted, even admired by the city. But now, everything was hanging by a thread. The system he had devoted himself to had failed him. The officers had taken everything he believed in, his dignity, his pride, his sense of justice, and torn it down. The world was watching him now, waiting to see if he would stand up for what was right, or if he would let the system bury it. The room seemed to close in on him. His career was at risk. His family was already under enough stress. But he couldn't let it go. He couldn't sit idly by while the officers were allowed to walk away without facing real consequences. He had to decide whether to push forward, knowing the risks involved, or to step back and allow the system to take care of it. But even as he sat there, the doubt creeping in, he knew there was no easy answer. If he pushed too hard, if he made this a fight between him and the entire department, he could lose everything. His colleagues, those who had once trusted him, would turn on him. He might even lose his position. But if he backed down, if he let the officers get away with their actions, he would lose something far more important, his integrity. And that was something he couldn't afford to lose. He picked up his phone and dialed his wife's number. It rang twice before she answered, her voice calm but tinged with worry. "Yara," he said, his voice unsteady. "It's all out there. The public knows what happened. The officers are being investigated, but it's not over. There's still the press conference tomorrow. I don't know what to say. I don't know if I can stand by and let them get away with this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean? Are you planning to do something about it?" "I don't know," he admitted, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "I want to do the right thing, but I'm scared. I'm scared of what it'll cost. I'm scared of what it means for us, for our future." Yara's voice softened, and he could hear the concern in her words. "You've always fought for justice, for what's right. I know this isn't easy, but you've come this far. You can't let them win. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." The word struck him deeply, reminding him of everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in. The truth was in front of him, undeniable and clear. The question wasn't whether the officers were guilty, it was whether he was willing to fight for justice, regardless of the consequences. As the conversation ended and he put his phone down, the decision became clearer. The city might be on edge, but he couldn't remain silent. He had to take a stand. He had to ensure that this wasn't just another case swept under the rug. The next day, the chief prosecutor stood in front of the media, cameras flashing in every direction. His mind was clear now, his resolve unwavering. He knew the stakes. He knew what this could cost him, but he also knew that justice had to be done. He looked into the camera, his voice steady and firm, as he spoke to the public. "The investigation into the actions of the officers involved in my wrongful arrest has revealed clear evidence of racial bias. I will not stand by and allow this behavior to go unpunished. The system must be held accountable, and I will ensure that justice is served." The suspense hung in the air as the room fell silent. The words were out there now. His next move had been made. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was packed. The air inside felt thick with anticipation as the doors closed behind the chief prosecutor. The media had turned the trial into a spectacle, and the public, once skeptical, now watched intently as the proceedings began. The officers were seated across the room, their faces a mixture of defiance and unease, their fates hanging in the balance. The tension was palpable, and everyone in the room knew that this trial was more than just about two officers, it was about accountability, justice, and whether the system was capable of change. The chief prosecutor stood at his desk, staring at the judge's bench, his hands resting on the wood, palms flat. His mind raced as he mentally prepared for the task ahead. He had come a long way from that moment on the street, when he had been wrongfully accused and humiliated. The emotional journey he had gone through, anger, frustration, doubt, had led him here. But the real test was just beginning. He wasn't just going to stand there and argue his case, he was going to fight for what was right. His role in this case had always been personal, but now, it was about something much larger, the message it would send to the public, to the city, and to everyone who had ever been made to feel inferior because of their race. The prosecutor's opening statement was succinct but powerful. His voice echoed through the courtroom as he spoke about the actions of the officers, the systemic nature of racial profiling, and the harm that prejudice could inflict, not just on the individuals directly involved but on the trust that society placed in law enforcement. He made it clear that this case wasn't just about what happened that night, but about the deep-rooted issues that had allowed it to happen in the first place. The officers in this case, he said, acted out of bias. They saw a man and assumed his guilt based on his appearance, not on any evidence. That assumption led to the wrongful detention and humiliation of an innocent person. This is not just a mistake, it is a violation of trust, of the very principles that law enforcement is supposed to uphold. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. These officers must face the consequences of their actions, not because they are bad people, but because their actions represent something much larger than themselves. This is about accountability. This is about ensuring that the law is not just something we talk about, but something we live by, no matter who you are or where you come from. As the case progressed, the evidence against the officers became more and more undeniable. The security footage, the witness testimonies, and the damning interviews from both the officers themselves, all painted a picture of bias, of assumptions made without question, and of actions taken without any consideration of the consequences. The defense tried to spin the situation, arguing that the officers had acted in good faith, but the facts were too clear. Their motives had been racially driven, and that could not be overlooked. The chief prosecutor sat through it all, his emotions fluctuating between a quiet anger and an intense sense of responsibility. He had spent his career fighting for justice, and now, in this very courtroom, he had the chance to make sure that justice was served. But as the trial wore on, he began to realize that this case was more than just a professional duty, it was a deeply personal reckoning. He had spent years trying to rise above the biases and prejudices that had marked his life, but the sting of what had happened to him on that street corner was still fresh. As he took the stand to testify, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't just speaking about what had happened that night, he was speaking about everything he had ever faced as a black man in a system that often saw him as less than. His voice was steady as he recounted the events, but underneath the calm exterior, his mind was racing. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the judges, the jury, and the officers who sat across from him. This was his moment, the one he had prepared for. But it was also the moment where he had to confront the parts of himself he had tried to bury, the feelings of humiliation, of vulnerability, and of the deep, abiding pain that came from being judged before even speaking a word. "I didn't ask for this to happen," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "I didn't ask to be placed in this position. But I can't stand by and let this go unnoticed. I can't let these officers walk away without facing the consequences of their actions. Because what they did goes beyond me. It goes beyond my family, beyond my career. It's about the trust we place in each other. The trust that says we are all equal, that we all deserve the same respect." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in the trial, the officers seemed to shrink back in their seats. The chief prosecutor had laid bare the truth of the matter, their actions were not just a personal attack on him, they were an attack on the very foundation of what it meant to be equal under the law. The final decision came down to the jury, and after what felt like an eternity, the verdict was read aloud. The officers were found guilty of racial profiling, of misconduct, and of violating the rights of the chief prosecutor. The courtroom was silent as the judge declared their sentence. They would face suspension, retraining, and, most importantly, public accountability. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. It was a clear message that the system could and would hold its own accountable, no matter how high they climbed or how deep the bias ran. As the chief prosecutor walked out of the courtroom, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had won. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, who had ever been judged based on their skin color, who had ever been forced to fight for the same rights that others took for granted. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal triumph. He stepped outside, taking in the cool air, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something other than the pressure of the past few weeks. There was a sense of redemption in the air, a sense that, for once, justice had been served. He hadn't just fought for the system, he had fought for his dignity, his family, and his future. And in doing so, he had reminded the world that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about the people it was meant to protect. The journey from humiliation to triumph was marked by one simple truth: standing up for what is right, no matter the cost, was worth every ounce of sacrifice. And that truth, above all else, was his final victory. The days after the trial felt strangely empty. The chief prosecutor, now victorious in the legal sense, found himself grappling with a deep sense of reflection. He had won the case. He had seen the officers held accountable, and justice had been served. But victory didn't feel like he had expected. It wasn't the weight of the gavel that made him pause, it was the silence that followed. The courtroom had emptied, the media had moved on to the next story, and yet, he still stood there, grappling with something more profound than the case itself. Walking through the streets of the city, the sounds of traffic and voices around him felt distant. The crowd seemed unchanged, indifferent to the personal journey that had just unfolded. But for him, everything had shifted. He had always believed in the law, in the power of justice, in the idea that everyone deserved fairness. But now, he understood the truth on a much deeper level: justice was never guaranteed, and fairness didn't just happen because the law said it should. It was something you had to fight for. Every single day. His journey had been one of tremendous personal growth. From the moment he had been wrongly accused by those officers, his world had been turned upside down. The anger, the humiliation, the confusion, all of it had built a fire inside him. But it wasn't just about fighting for himself anymore. As the days passed and the verdict was delivered, he realized that his battle wasn't just about getting justice for one man, it was about something far bigger. It was about standing up for the countless people who had faced the same kind of bias, the same kind of prejudice, without ever having the chance to be heard. He had always known the system was flawed. But it wasn't until he had been on the receiving end of that flaw that he truly understood how deeply it ran. He had spent years working within the system, trying to make it better from the inside. But now he knew. True change didn't come from within the system, it came from challenging it, from forcing it to confront its own imperfections. And sometimes, that meant standing up, even when it was easier to stay quiet, even when the cost of speaking out seemed too high. As he sat down with his wife, Yara, in their living room that evening, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. She had been his rock through all of it, through the nights of doubt, through the fear of what might happen next. And now, as they shared a quiet moment together, he could see the pride in her eyes, not just for what he had done, but for what they had both endured together. "You were right," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of all he had learned. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm glad I didn't back down." Yara smiled, a tired but content smile. "I knew you wouldn't. You've always stood up for what's right, even when it was hard. And I'm proud of you." The chief prosecutor nodded slowly, the memories of the trial still fresh in his mind. "It's not just about me, though. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly, everyone who's ever been looked at as less than, because of who they are or what they look like. The fight for justice isn't over. It's never over." He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the months that had passed since that fateful encounter with the two officers. In the quiet moments, when the world wasn't watching, he had asked himself whether it had been worth it. Whether the personal cost, the sleepless nights, the strain on his family, the fear of losing everything, had been worth the outcome. And he had come to the simple truth that yes, it had been. Because the fight for justice wasn't just about winning the case. It was about making sure that the next person who found themselves in the same position didn't have to fight alone. "I used to think that if I played by the rules, if I followed the system, everything would be fair," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But now I know the truth, the system doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. Sometimes, you have to make it work. You have to demand fairness, even when it's hard." Yara reached across the table, her hand finding his. "You've always been strong," she said quietly. "But now, you're even stronger. You fought for something bigger than yourself. And that's something not everyone can do. He squeezed her hand, grateful for her unwavering support. He had always known he couldn't do this alone, but now, he realized just how much more he had to offer the world. He had fought for justice, not just as a prosecutor, but as a human being who knew what it felt like to be judged, to be dismissed, to be underestimated. And he had come out the other side, not just with a legal victory, but with a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly fight for what was right. The final lesson, the one that resonated with him more than anything else, was that standing up against injustice wasn't easy. It was never easy. But it was necessary. It was about more than just doing what was right in the moment, it was about making sure that the world could be better, for everyone, in the long run. As he looked out the window, the night settling over the city, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had won. But more importantly, he had learned something far more valuable. Justice wasn't just a concept. It was a fight. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, it would always be worth fighting for. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.